Hi, my name is April, and this is High Fantasy Writing. In today's video, I wanted to address some types of criticisms that I often seen levied against especially fantasy works that I personally feel is a misunderstanding of what the fantasy genre is. I see this critique especially a lot when fantasy authors have their world, their fantasy world, set in a non-European style of fantasy land. And this, I feel like, even more than the people who critique the regular European medieval fantasy type of thing, I feel like it's especially obvious when they set it in not medieval Europe, where the criticism comes up that, well, that's not how the real world culture is. So I found this critique with the Shadow and Bone trilogy because it is set in a Russian-style fantasy. I have found this critique with the Conqueror saga, which is set in a Ottoman Empire-style fantasy world. And I've seen this in the Wheel of Time series, which is not a medieval fantasy series, but it is critiqued as though it is supposed to be medieval fantasy. So people who say have a lot of experience about real world medieval goings on and how society worked and the different technology that was available to real world medieval people attack the fantasy world and say, oh, well, you didn't do that right because they wouldn't have had X, Y, or Z in that time period, or women wouldn't have been allowed to do X, Y, or Z in that time period. And this also comes across heavily with different non-European cultures. So with the Shadow and Bone example, it is set, Ravka is a Russian-inspired fantasy world, whereas the country to the north is a very Nordic style fantasy world, and to the south it is a very Chinese Mongolian style fantasy world. Now, some criticisms that I see a lot are that, say, Alina Starkov's name is not how it would traditionally be done in modern day or real world Russian. Alina would have the last name Starkova because last names were gendered in real life Russia. And so they criticize this fantasy world that is based on or inspired by Russia. And they think, haha, I've got you. You didn't do it exactly the way they do it in real life Russia. Therefore, it is bad. And so I really wanted to talk about how being inspired by a culture or being inspired by a period in history or inspired by real life events in a fantasy novel is not the same thing as trying to one-for-one recreate that in your fantasy novel. I see this a lot with names, cultures, the architecture in different places, even the weather. People criticize books and things about like, oh, well, that's not even what the weather would be like in this part of the world where you are claiming that your fantasy novel is based on. And I kind of, especially when it comes from this is a different culture that is not seen normally in fantasy, I understand the knee-jerk reaction to point out any cultural flaws that the author might have put in the work and say, you're not representing this culture properly. This culture doesn't get a lot of representation normally, and you're not doing it perfectly right, and wanting to push back against possibly negative stereotypes of the culture or just misconceptions about the culture. But I feel like, especially when you're talking about fantasy novels and fantasy novels that are just loosely inspired by said cultures, as long as it's not actually damaging, like the idea that Alina Starkov's name is Alina Starkov, not Starkova, that's not hurting anyone. That's not like saying Russian people are all like X stereotype that's negative. That's just a name, and it's not that, like, Leigh Bardugo, the author, was not trying to say this is what Russia really is like, or this is what Russia in the general time period that I was inspired by was really like. That's not what fantasy is. Fantasy is when you're inspired by a culture, it's mostly just a backdrop where you can include like significant aspects of the culture, but it's not attempting to make a moral judgment on that culture at that point in time. Most fantasy is creating its own culture to talk about, or own issues in that setting to talk about, that is unique to that fantasy world. So I don't find the criticisms that are saying it's damaging to this culture that you have been inspired by, unless they can point to specific reasons or stereotypes, things like that, that would harm the actual culture that it was just inspired by. I don't find people saying, well, I'm a super history buff, so I'm going to point out all the flaws in your fantasy novel. I don't find those to be very compelling or good or valid or needs to be heard criticism. It can be very frustrating for an author who is trying to create their own unique world to do so without drawing inspiration from the real world. That's pretty much impossible to not be inspired by anything at all in the real world when you're writing fantasy novels. But what makes them fantasy is that they're not the real world. There are fantastical elements. They have their own histories that incorporate these fantastical elements. And so it's not helpful or useful to try and say, well, I know how castles were created in medieval England, and you have your castle with this tower that should be structurally unsound, so I'm going to tell you that your novel is bad and you don't know how to write, and you're just a terrible author. Like, that's not valid criticism. You just need to take a step back and realize that maybe your smartness isn't needed right now. It's not useful right now. It's not relevant right now. I don't care that you know how the monarchy traditionally worked in medieval England. I don't care, because my novel that is a fantasy novel is not set in historically accurate medieval England. It's not. I don't care that you know how Russian names work in the real world Russia. If I want to have a Russian-inspired country that has, say, the same topography as Russia, that has some of the same architecture as Russia, and has Russian-sounding things in it, the fact that I don't gender my characters' last names isn't a bad thing, isn't a thing that can be criticized, because it's a fantasy world. Maybe in this fantasy world, the Russian language, well, the completely not Russian language, this fantasy language, didn't find a need to gender everything or anybody's last names. In English, you don't gender last names, so why would that be the case in this other fantasy land? I see a lot of people trying to jump on the gotcha woke train, which is very frustrating as somebody who cares very deeply about societal issues and someone who cares deeply about socio-cultural problems and really terrible, terrible things happening in society. And I care deeply about the lack of representation in our fantasy works, in our just media works in general. But to say that if you don't become an expert on every single inspiration that you could have for a fantasy novel, if you wanted to have one of the countries in your fantasy novel based on Imperial China, to say that now, in order to write about that, you have to learn every single Chinese dialect that was spoken at the time. You have to spend years and years of research and study on the Forbidden City and how each of the dynasties came into being and fell out of being. You have to do extensive research on every single aspect of Imperial Chinese culture before you're able to write about it in a fantasy setting where you're going to be changing a whole bunch of stuff anyways. But wait, you're not allowed to change anything because you were inspired by this other culture, so it has to be a one-for-one recreation in your fantasy novel. It's not helpful for anybody really, because it's not Imperial China that I'm putting in my book. It's a fantasy version that is inspired by some of the aspects of that period in history. Now, if you use that to have a whole bunch of really insulting and incorrect, stereotypes and make people believe that you think that this is how it actually was in that time period, then that's a problem. But if you make it abundantly clear that this is a fantasy world, this is not a one-for-one recreation of this real life culture or place, this is a fantastical place that I have created, that I have been inspired by different cultures. That's a different thing. There is absolutely a problem with people writing in insulting stereotypes for races and countries and cultures. But when you're in a fantasy world and you have expanded upon these fantasy countries that you've made, some have aspects of real world places, but they also have layers upon layers of the fantasy world's culture and backgrounds and histories and all of the fantasy layers to them. It's not just here's a very vague country that has been inspired by X real country, and that's all the work that I put into it it's a vague recreation of X country. Now that's a problem. But when you have created a country in a fantasy world that you have based or have some inspiration from a real world country, it's your job as an author to make it your own, and your own in a fantasy, not real life way. So I guess my point with this video is that when you want to make a critique about a work of fiction, a work of fantasy, take a look at what the author was intending and take a look at your own preconceived notions about what you thought the book was going to be about. If you thought the book was going, say, Shadow and Bone, which is the most popular example I can think of right now, if you went into the book Shadow and Bone expecting a one-for-one recreation of Russia, and you got Ravka, yeah, you might kind of sit there and be like, well, this isn't really what Russia in X time period was like, or these name things are not the way that Russians actually do them in real life. Maybe take a step back and think, okay, but are we in Russia? Or are we in Ravka? Is Alina Starkov's name an inaccurate Russian name? Maybe, but it's not an inaccurate Ravkan name, because Ravka is not Russia. It is a fantasy world that was inspired by Russia. So just take a look at your critiques and think, okay, is the author severely, actually hurting people of this culture that she has inspired her world by? Or is it just a fantasy world that has some aspects that I recognize from this real world culture that's not hurting anyone? It's just the style. Do you want every single style to be medieval Europe? That's boring. That's medieval fantasy. A lot of times is not accurate to what medieval Europe was like. That's not the point of fantasy set in a medieval setting. It's just the setting. It's the flavor that is infused in the world. You can add so many different layers to that make it unique and not the real world equivalent. So there is absolutely valid criticism that you can make about works of fiction being inspired by a real world place if they promote insulting stereotypes, if they always make X stereotype or X culture the villain in their books, if they don't actually flesh out the cultures that they are bringing inspiration from, if they don't flesh it out and make it their own. There's absolutely criticism available there. But just because the author did not make a one-for-one recreation of a culture or a point in history or a country that you personally know a great deal about, doesn't mean that the author did something wrong or bad. It just means that they found inspiration in that culture and wanted to include aspects of it into their fantasy novel, and perhaps bring some attention to that culture so that people could look into it themselves. So being inspired by a real life place and wanting to put that inspiration into an aspect of your fantasy novel is not an attempt to make a one-for-one recreation of that real life place or time or culture. It is simply being inspired by an aspect of something. So I hope that this video was helpful. I hope it resonated with you and made sense to you as to why I wanted to make a video about this topic. I do have another video on my channel about microdiversity in writing that goes deeper into my thoughts about how to ensure that when you are creating a culture or drawing from a culture in your fictional works, you're making sure you're not making insulting stereotypes or just extremely flat characters or cultures that aren't super great for real diversity in your writing. So if you want to take a look at that, I will probably link it somewhere, somehow, on this video. My name is April. This is High Fantasy Writing. If you did enjoy, give it a thumbs up. and subscribe if you want to see more of this type of content. I've been playing around with making a Patreon where you can get a write out of my scripts for these different videos, and so you can have like a physical reading copy of what I'm saying instead of trying to, like, I don't know if you want to take notes on the video or whatever. I know that it's kind of difficult for me sometimes watching writing advice videos because I'm like, oh, these are a lot of great points. I'm not going to remember them. Let me pause the video real quick and take some notes type of thing. So if you would be interested in me starting up a Patreon so that you can get actual write-outs of my scripts, let me know. Just kind of floating that idea out there. I know I don't have a whole bunch of viewers at the moment, but if I do get more viewers in the future, I think that that might be a really cool thing to offer anybody who wants to support me financially. I hope that everyone has a wonderful day and happy writing!